The rain poured heavily over Riverstone City, soaking everything in its path. The bright lights from tall buildings and expensive shops lit up the streets, but they felt out of reach for Ethan, a 13-year-old boy trying to find shelter from the storm. His jacket was too big and full of holes, his shoes were soaked, and his stomach growled with hunger. Life hadn't been kind to Ethan. 2 years ago, after his grandmother passed away, he was left with his stepfather, who was cruel and abusive. One day, he couldn't take it anymore and ran away. Now, the streets were his home, and each day was a fight to stay safe and find food. Tonight, Ethan stood under the awning of a closed diner, trying to stay dry. As he huddled there, he heard two women walk by, talking loudly over the sound of the rain. "Can you believe it? Barron Trump is going to the gala tonight," one said. "In this weather," the other replied. "Of course, it's the biggest event of the year." Ethan didn't know much about Barron Trump, except that he was a rich and important man. To Ethan, that world of fancy galas and powerful people felt like a completely different planet. He shook his head and pulled his jacket tighter, ready to keep moving. But something about what the women said stuck in his mind. He had no idea that tonight, in the middle of this storm, his life would change forever, and it would all start with meeting Barron Trump. The rain was relentless, pounding against Ethan's thin jacket as he walked along the nearly empty streets. He pulled the hood tighter around his face, trying to shield himself from the icy wind. He passed under a small awning near a convenience store, finally catching a break from the storm. Suddenly, he noticed a group of people ahead, hurrying past something, or someone, on the sidewalk. Ethan squinted through the rain and saw a figure lying there, unmoving. His heart skipped a beat. "What's going on?" he mumbled to himself. Curiosity got the better of him, and he cautiously moved closer. The closer he got, the clearer the figure became, a man in a suit, soaked and lying face down on the pavement. His light-colored hair was plastered to his head from the rain, and even though the figure wasn't moving much, Ethan felt a strange familiarity. His breath caught in his throat when he realized who it was. "Barron Trump?" Ethan whispered in disbelief. The name sent a jolt of fear through him. Barron Trump was one of the wealthiest and most powerful people in the city. What was someone like him doing here, alone and unconscious, in the middle of a storm? Ethan glanced around, hoping someone else would step in, but the few passers-by just kept walking, ignoring the man on the ground. Ethan's hands trembled. He wanted to walk away. Getting involved could mean trouble, questions from the police, maybe even getting blamed for something he didn't do. But then he heard his grandmother's voice in his head, as clear as if she were standing next to him. "Always do the right thing, no matter how hard it feels." Ethan clenched his fists and made his decision. He couldn't just leave Barron there. Carefully, he crouched beside the man, shielding him as much as he could from the rain. "Sir? Can you hear me?" Ethan's voice was shaky as he gently shook Barron's shoulder. There was no response. Panic bubbled up in Ethan's chest as he checked for a pulse, just like he'd seen on TV. It was there, weak, but there. Ethan pulled out his old phone, the screen cracked but still working, and dialed 911 with shaky fingers. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's voice was calm and steady. There's a man, he collapsed on the sidewalk. I think it's Barron Trump. He's not moving, and his pulse is weak, Ethan stammered. Barron Trump? The operator sounded surprised. Where are you? I'm near the corner of Cedar Street and Fifth Avenue. Please, send someone fast. Ethan's voice cracked. Help is on the way. Stay with him and try to keep him warm if you can. Ethan looked down at his worn hoodie. It wasn't much, but it was all he had. Without thinking twice, he slipped it off and draped it over Barron's chest, trying to shield him from the rain. The cold bit at Ethan's skin, but he didn't care. The sound of sirens grew louder, and soon, flashing red and blue lights lit up the street. Paramedics rushed toward them, asking questions and moving quickly to check Barron's condition. Ethan stepped back, his heart racing. He didn't want to stick around long enough to be questioned. As the paramedics loaded Barron into the ambulance, Ethan turned and slipped away into the shadows, unnoticed. His body was freezing, but his heart felt heavy and full at the same time. He had done the right thing, just like his grandmother would have wanted. What Ethan didn't realize was that his small act of bravery would soon become a story the whole city would talk about, and it would change his life forever. The news spread like wildfire. Barron Trump, one of the wealthiest and most influential figures in the city, had been saved during a medical emergency by a young boy. Every media outlet reported on the mysterious boy who disappeared into the night after helping Barron survive. Security footage from nearby cameras began circulating, showing a soaked boy kneeling beside Barron in the rain, calling for help and placing his hoodie over him. It didn't take long for investigators to piece together the clues. The boy was Ethan, a 13-year-old who had been living on the streets for months. When the Trump family learned his identity, Barron personally insisted on meeting Ethan to thank him. At first, Ethan wasn't sure. What would someone like Barron Trump want with a kid like him? But something told him to accept the invitation. A black car arrived at the shelter where Ethan had been staying since the story broke. The driver opened the door and politely gestured for him to get in. Nervously, Ethan climbed inside. The ride to Barron Trump's estate felt surreal. His hands fidgeted with the hem of his borrowed jacket, and he couldn't stop thinking about how out of place he was in a world of luxury. The car pulled up to a massive, gleaming estate. Ethan's jaw dropped as he stepped out, overwhelmed by the grandeur. A butler led him through the hallways until they arrived at a large, elegant room. Barron Trump stood waiting, his face calm but full of emotion. "Ethan," Barron said, stepping forward. "Thank you for saving my life. I don't even know how to express how grateful I am." Ethan shifted uncomfortably. "I just did what anyone would have done," he mumbled. "No," Barron said firmly. "You did something extraordinary. So many people walked past me that night, but you stopped. You didn't have to, but you did." Ethan glanced up, meeting Barron's gaze. "You needed help," he said simply. "I couldn't just leave you there." Barron motioned for Ethan to sit on the couch. "You're braver than most adults I know. Can I ask, why? After everything I've said about homelessness, after how people like me have ignored kids like you?" Ethan hesitated, then sighed. "My grandmother always told me to help people, no matter who they are. When I saw you there, you weren't Barron Trump. You were just someone who needed help." Barron nodded slowly, his expression thoughtful. "Ethan, I've spent my life thinking about problems like poverty and homelessness in terms of numbers and policies, but you've shown me that it's about people, real people with real stories." Encouraged by Barron's words, Ethan shared his journey, his grandmother's kindness, the struggles after her death, and the constant fight to survive on the streets. As he spoke, Barron listened intently, his eyes filled with regret and understanding. "I was wrong," Barron said quietly when Ethan finished. "I thought I understood the issue, but I didn't. You've changed that for me." In that moment, the walls between their vastly different worlds began to crumble. Ethan's act of kindness had sparked something Barron couldn't ignore. It wasn't just about gratitude, it was about change. The next day, the headlines were even louder. Barron Trump had announced a $20 million initiative to combat youth homelessness. Cameras flashed as he stood in front of a podium, addressing the public with an uncharacteristic warmth and humility. "I owe my life to a brave young boy named Ethan," Barron began. "But this isn't just about gratitude. That night, Ethan reminded me of something we often forget: behind every statistic is a human being, a child, who deserves a chance." Ethan stood to the side, feeling both proud and overwhelmed. Barron continued, outlining his vision for the initiative. It would include the creation of safe, welcoming shelters specifically designed for children and teens, educational programs to help them build a future, and resources for families to prevent homelessness from happening in the first place. After the announcement, Barron turned to Ethan. "This isn't just my initiative," he said. "I want you to help shape it. No one understands this issue better than someone who's lived it." Ethan blinked, stunned. "Me?" he asked. "I don't know anything about running programs." "You know more than you think," Barron replied with a reassuring smile. "You've lived through it. You know what kids like you need better than anyone in this room." Ethan thought about it for a moment. The idea of being part of something so big was daunting, but it was also exciting. "Okay," he said cautiously, "but I have a condition." Barron raised an eyebrow. "Name it." "I can't do this alone," Ethan said. "I want other kids involved, kids who've been through this, like me. My friend Sarah, for example. She's smart and has helped so many of us out on the streets. And we need to focus on the real reasons kids end up homeless in the first place, not just temporary fixes." Barron nodded thoughtfully. "That's exactly the kind of input we need. Consider it done." Within days, Barron's team began organizing meetings to bring Ethan and other street kids into the planning process. Ethan insisted on holding the first meeting in a neutral, familiar space, an old community center near the park where many of the kids used to gather. He wanted them to feel safe and heard. At the meeting, Ethan introduced Sarah and a few other kids he trusted. Barron's team was there, but they let Ethan and his friends take the lead. Sarah spoke passionately about the dangers kids faced every night, from violence to exploitation. Another boy, Jake, talked about how hard it was to focus on school when you didn't know where your next meal was coming from. "We don't just need beds and meals," Ethan said. "We need a way out, a way to feel like we matter." Barron sat in the back, quietly taking notes. He had insisted on being present, not as a businessman or philanthropist, but as a listener. By the end of the meeting, the plan had expanded. The initiative would include mentorship programs, mental health support, job training, and community outreach to prevent homelessness before it started. Ethan felt a spark of hope he hadn't experienced in a long time. Afterward, Barron pulled Ethan aside. "You were incredible today," he said. "You've got a gift for this." Ethan shrugged, trying to downplay it. "I just said what needed to be said." "No," Barron insisted. "You spoke from the heart, and people listened. That's leadership." Ethan felt a swell of pride but quickly grounded himself. "It's not about me. It's about all of us." Barron smiled. "And that's why you're the perfect person to lead this." As the weeks went by, the initiative began to take shape. Ethan and his friends worked alongside Barron's team, ensuring that the plans reflected the realities of life on the streets. It wasn't just about giving kids a place to sleep, it was about giving them a future. For the first time in a long time, Ethan felt like he belonged, not just to a program, but to a movement. And he wasn't alone. Kids like Sarah, Jake, and so many others were stepping up, ready to turn their pain into purpose. What had started as a single act of kindness on a rainy night had grown into something far bigger than Ethan could have imagined. It wasn't just a second chance for him, it was a second chance for countless others, too. The rain had stopped, but its impact lingered. The night Ethan saved Barron Trump became more than just a moment, it became a catalyst for change. Just days after the life-changing encounter, Barron announced the creation of the Ethan Foundation during a televised press conference. This foundation is not just about helping homeless youth, it's about creating a system that listens to them, learns from them, and empowers them, Barron said. The foundation's mission was to tackle youth homelessness at its roots, providing not just temporary shelters, but education, family support, and mental health care. The decision to name the foundation after Ethan was Barron's way of honoring the boy's courage and shining a light on the humanity behind the statistics. Ethan, initially hesitant about all the attention, accepted the responsibility with newfound confidence. "If this can help other kids like me," he said, "then it's worth it." Within weeks, the foundation had secured a headquarters in the heart of Riverstone City, and plans were underway to open the first Ethan Center, a state-of-the-art shelter designed with input from Ethan and other kids. The center would include private rooms, classrooms, a rooftop garden, and spaces for counseling and career training. Ethan's transformation. For the first time in over a year, Ethan had a stable home. Barron personally ensured that Ethan was placed with a supportive foster family who valued his input and treated him with kindness. Ethan was also enrolled in school, where he quickly caught up on missed lessons with the help of tutors provided by the foundation. Ethan's days were filled with new experiences. When he wasn't in school, he was meeting with the foundation's board members, sharing his ideas for how to make the shelters truly effective. His role as a youth ambassador allowed him to speak directly to donors, policymakers, and the media. His voice became a powerful tool for change, and he learned to channel his emotions into action. But Ethan never forgot where he came from. Every week, he visited the streets he once called home, checking in on friends like Sarah and encouraging them to join the foundation's programs. Sarah, now part of the youth advisory team, was thriving in her role and often joked that Ethan was getting too used to his new life. "Don't forget us when you're famous," she teased. "Never," Ethan always replied. The foundation's impact was immediate and widespread. The first Ethan Center opened within 3 months, and its design became a model for shelters nationwide. Families who had been separated by poverty and homelessness were reunited, and kids who had been ignored by the system finally had access to the resources they needed. One of the first success stories was Jake, a boy Ethan had known from the streets. With help from the foundation, Jake reconnected with his estranged mother and enrolled in a vocational program. "Ethan gave me hope," Jake said during an interview. "If he can do it, so can I." The foundation's programs also extended to prevention, offering support to at-risk families before they reached a breaking point. By addressing the underlying causes of homelessness, addiction, unemployment, and lack of affordable housing, the Ethan Foundation was creating long-term solutions, not just temporary fixes. Ethan and Barron's story captured the nation's heart. News outlets covered the foundation's progress, and social media buzzed with hashtags like #EthanFoundation and #HopeInAction. Donations poured in, allowing the foundation to expand its reach to other cities. Ethan became a symbol of resilience and hope. He was invited to speak at conferences, interviewed on talk shows, and even featured in a documentary about youth homelessness. Despite the spotlight, Ethan remained grounded, often crediting his grandmother's teachings for shaping his actions. "She always said kindness matters, no matter how small," he told one reporter. "I just did what she would have wanted me to do." Barron, too, experienced a transformation. His public image shifted from that of a reserved billionaire to a compassionate leader who wasn't afraid to admit his mistakes. "Ethan changed my perspective," he admitted during an interview. "He reminded me of what truly matters, using what we have to help those who need it most." 1 year after that fateful night, the Ethan Foundation had opened 3 centers, reunited dozens of families, and provided educational opportunities to hundreds of kids. Ethan, now a confident 14-year-old, stood beside Barron at the ribbon-cutting ceremony for the newest center. As he looked out at the crowd, he spotted Sarah, Jake, and others who had once shared the streets with him. They smiled and waved, proud of how far they had all come. In his speech, Ethan said, "This isn't just about me. It's about all of us, every kid out there who feels invisible, every family struggling to stay together. If we can change one life, we can change the world." The applause was deafening, but what mattered most to Ethan were the kids in the audience, the ones who saw him and realized they weren't alone. He hoped they saw in him a reminder that even in the darkest times, kindness and courage could light the way. The Ethan Foundation was more than a program, it was a movement. And Ethan, once a homeless boy in the rain, was at its heart, proving that one act of kindness could ripple out to change countless lives. The sun was setting over Riverstone City as Ethan stood in front of the newly completed Ethan Center for Youth. The building, with its warm lights glowing through tall windows, stood as a symbol of hope and change. Around him, the laughter of children filled the air, their excitement buzzing as they explored the center for the first time. Ethan took a deep breath, letting the moment sink in. Looking at the Ethan Center, Ethan couldn't help but think back to that stormy night. Just over a year ago, he had been a cold, hungry kid with no direction, clutching a damp hoodie as he walked the city streets. If someone had told him then that he would one day be standing here, surrounded by people who saw him as a hero, he wouldn't have believed it. Kindness matters, his grandmother had always said. He had acted on those words when he saw Barron Trump lying helpless in the rain. He hadn't thought about fame, recognition, or even what it might cost him, he had simply done what felt right. Now, that one moment of kindness had grown into something bigger than he ever imagined. Ethan glanced at the faces of the children running around the center's gardens and hallways. He saw himself in their smiles and their cautious eyes, kids who had been through too much but were finally starting to feel safe. Knowing he had played a part in giving them that chance filled him with a sense of pride and purpose he'd never felt before. Standing beside Ethan, Barron Trump adjusted his tie and smiled as he watched the scene unfold. "This is your moment," he said, placing a hand on Ethan's shoulder. "You deserve every bit of it." Barron had always seen himself as a leader, but it wasn't until that rainy night that he began to understand what leadership truly meant. Meeting Ethan had been a wake-up call, forcing him to confront his own biases and assumptions about homelessness. It wasn't statistics or policies that had moved him, it was Ethan's humanity and courage. In his speech earlier that day, Barron had addressed the crowd with humility and gratitude. "Ethan didn't just save my life," he had said. "He changed it. He reminded me that leadership isn't about power or wealth, it's about using what you have to lift others up." The ribbon-cutting ceremony was simple but heartfelt. Ethan and Barron stood side by side, holding the oversized scissors, while a crowd of supporters, kids, and staff cheered them on. As the ribbon fell, the doors to the Ethan Center officially opened. The center wasn't just a shelter, it was a place where kids could dream again. With private rooms, classrooms, counseling spaces, and even a rooftop garden, it was designed to provide not just safety but a sense of dignity and hope. Ethan's input, along with that of other kids, had ensured it would truly meet their needs. As the event wound down, Ethan found a quiet moment to himself in the rooftop garden. He looked out at the city, the skyline glowing with lights. It was the same city that had once felt so unforgiving, but now it held a promise of something better, not just for him, but for so many others. Barron joined him, his voice soft as he said, "You've done something incredible here, Ethan. But this is just the beginning." Ethan smiled. "I know. There's still so much work to do. But it feels good to know we've started." Barron nodded. "You've taught me something important. Leadership isn't about standing above people, it's about standing with them. I'm proud to stand with you." Ethan felt his chest swell with pride. He thought of all the kids who would walk through the doors of the Ethan Center, of the families that would be reunited, and of the lives that would be changed. It wasn't just his journey anymore, it was a shared mission to create a better future. As the two stood in the garden, the sounds of laughter and hope rising from below, Ethan realized that his grandmother had been right all along. One small act of kindness really could ripple out to change the world. This was just the beginning of a new story, one written with compassion, courage, and the belief that everyone deserved a second chance. Ethan wasn't just a survivor anymore. He was a leader, a symbol of hope, and proof that even the smallest voices could make the biggest impact.